On May 14th, 1948, exactly 73 years ago today, the Jewish Agency chairman at the time, David Ben-Gurion, formally declared the independence of the State of Israel. Only 11 minutes later, U.S. President Harry S. Truman made one of the most momentous decisions of his presidency by recognizing the new Jewish state. Joining us today is our good friend, Dr. Kurt Graham, director of the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum, for an exclusive tour of the newly renovated museum, including a sneak peek of an exhibit on the founding of the State of Israel. But before turning over the floor to Dr. Graham, I'd first like to introduce American Jewish Committee CEO David Harris, who joins us to provide a special message that relates both to the Truman legacy and to Israel today. David.
Thank you, Daniel, and hello to everyone on this call. When we first scheduled this call, of course, we didn't know what would be happening in Israel as we meet. And so, to be very honest, we wondered internally at AJC, should we go ahead with this call at this time or not? And the answer was, we should. We are extraordinarily mindful as we meet of what is happening in Israel. AJC has been among the most vocal and steadfast supporters of the State of Israel, and never more so than now, as some in the world struggle to distinguish between moral clarity and moral fog, have difficulty understanding the difference between an arsonist, Hamas, and the firefighter, Israel, a tyranny, Hamas, and a democracy, Israel, an aggressor, Hamas, and a victim, Israel. So as we meet, our thoughts, our sentiments are with the State of Israel. We hope and pray that peace will soon return. We mourn the casualties, and especially the children. But we also understand that this is a defining moment for Israel and all of its friends and supporters around the world, including us at American Jewish Committee, stand shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm with the people of Israel. And that brings us to today's event. Why did we decide to go forward? For two main reasons. As Daniel Silver said a moment ago, because this is a significant anniversary. And we wouldn't even be talking about Israel today, but for May 14th, 1948, exactly 73 years ago. And we want to pay tribute to this anniversary and the rebirth of the State of Israel and its extraordinary journey from then until now. There's also a second reason. For those who know me a bit, you've heard me say 1,000 times, I'm a strict nonpartisan, and I am. But that doesn't mean I don't have favorite presidents. And among my most favorite presidents in American history is Harry S. Truman. I've been a fan of Truman for my adult life for many reasons. Among them, his courage and principle in rejecting the advice of many in his own administration by recognizing Israel 11 minutes after its establishment. I also feel that in today's world, where real, courageous, principled leadership on the political level is rare, too rare, in our tumultuous world, we can all learn from the example of Harry S. Truman. Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. Here was an extraordinary leader who in many ways was unprepared for the job, had never gone to college, much less to law school or a PhD program, and yet who rose to the occasion in a remarkable way and whose years from 1945 to 1953 really defined what we now call the post-war international order in so many ways. So the lesson of Truman is not just a historical lesson. I believe it's a contemporary lesson for political leadership. And I will add that if there were more Harry Trumans today, I would be more confident as I look around the world that there'd be more leaders of principle who would speak up clearly and unambiguously in support of the State of Israel as it faces this relentless enemy. And that brings me to the pleasure that I have in introducing Dr. Kurt Graham, who will be our host and tour guide and scholar for the rest of this session. Kurt and AJC have been friends for a number of years. In 2018, he and his wife came with us to Israel, where we had the Global Forum, and he spoke from the stage about Truman and the Israel legacy. He was so brilliant, he was so popular, that we invited him back in 2019 to come to our Washington stage, where he spoke about Truman and the civil rights struggle. Now we bring Kurt Graham to our virtual stage as our dear friend and our guide and scholar for the rest of this session. Kurt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, David. What a thrill to be with you and to have those kind words and just to, I just want to offer an amen to what you've said about Harry Truman, both his legacy, his example. I'm fond of saying that Harry Truman was a man who faced a lot of decisions, but he didn't just make a lot of decisions, he was decisive. And I think there's a difference. I mean, I think there was real leadership there because he did the right thing for the right reason. And I think he always returned to some sort of moral center. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about that as we get going before we get into the actual tour that we've taped for you, and very excited to share with you. This notion of standing that David mentioned, of standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel, arm in arm. David is not the first American to think in those terms. Obviously, Harry Truman said famously in a quote that we have used liberally in our new gallery dedicated to the recognition of Israel, that I believed in Israel before its founding. I believed in Israel before it existed as it does today. And for Truman, this was the long arc of history coming to fruition, coming to bear on this moment of time over which he presided. There are a lot of reasons we can look at as to why Truman did what he did. There are political, historical reasons, moral reasons, personal reasons that all came together in and around this decision in 1948. Now, that doesn't mean that this decision was undertaken without the potential of great personal risk and great political risk. I mean, the man literally put his presidency on the line when he did two very important things in 1948, recognized Israel in May, and then desegregated the armed forces and the federal workforce in July. Two very risky propositions in 1948, if you think about the state of America at that time, going up for re-election that fall. And so this was, and he famously said at one point, "I'd rather be right than be president." And, think about that statement for a minute and think about how many elected officials you know today who would trade their office for the moral certitude, for knowing that they had done the right thing. And I like David, I tend to be, I think of myself as very centrist. I'm in an apolitical position. I don't advocate for a party or for a group or for a particular candidate ever, but I look far and wide across the spectrum to find Truman's equal, and my search seems to be in vain. I don't believe that there are people like that anymore. And I think there are good people in the system, but I think the system even prevents some of our brighter stars from shining in that way. Just quickly, a little bit on the history before we get into this. We will, in the tour, you'll see a section. It's kind of the center portion of the gallery. It's kind of the midway point where Truman's recognition of Israel gallery comes together, and you'll see we have you won't get to see the film. You're going to have to come in person to see that. We have a wonderful piece that was narrated by Judy Woodruff of the PBS NewsHour. She did a remarkable job for us on that piece, and it really tells the story not just of the nation of Israel and its struggle to come to be, but of the back and forth in Harry Truman's own cabinet, his own State Department, his own administration. Famously, General Marshall, who was his Secretary of State, was very much opposed to this notion of recognition for a lot of political, geopolitical reasons, oil, lots of other things that he was concerned about. And, but another little Truman anecdote I just can't help but share at this moment that David McCullough captured so beautifully in his biography of Truman had to do with when Truman was deciding to appoint Marshall, whom he revered, a great American hero and great hero, and Eisenhower's mentor as well. And as he did that, as he decided, I want to appoint Marshall, one of his other advisors said to him, "Mr. President, be careful. If you appoint General Marshall, people will soon say that he would be a better president than you." And he said, "He would be a better president than I am. But that's not the point. I'm the president, and I need to be surrounded by the best people." And so again, there's a level of humility about the way Truman approached these things that I just find so refreshing and so reassuring. And like David, I wish I could go back and vote for Harry Truman and bring him back into leadership. The story, just in a nutshell, is, I mean, it unfolds long before 1948. I mean, you can think of this in biblical terms and go back to ancient peoples and ancient lands and promises and inheritances and those kinds of things. And certainly Truman was a student of all of that. Truman, as David mentioned, was not a professor. He didn't have a PhD or a law degree, didn't even get to go to college, but he was as well read as any professor of the day. And he was not only a student of history, he was a student of the Bible, not a theologian, not a particularly, he was a thoughtful, I suppose, spiritual man at a certain level, not in terms of a church-going, sort of tithe-paying, excited member of a particular faith. But I think that he certainly had the moral principles that were taught in a church setting. And his particular view of Christianity even led him to sort of bring that ancient and modern world together in a way that the gathering of scattered Israel for Harry Truman was not an allegory. It was not a mythological tale. It was not something that applied only to this one people. It was history. It was literal history. And he saw that history culminating on his watch. And so I think for Truman, there is that very sort of personal, I don't know if you want to call it spiritual or religious. I mean, I'll leave those, you can each choose what adjective you'd like to insert there. But I do think that there was something very deep inside of Harry Truman that informed his understanding of a long arc of history. But more recently, his own experience as a soldier in World War I. He saw combat in World War I. And in doing so, he came back from that war a changed man. And things like the Balfour Declaration, his relationship with Eddie Jacobson, that ended up helping him get, a meeting with Chaim Weizmann and other kinds of things that played into this 1948 decision. There's a lot that goes into this in Harry Truman's life. And I think that when I think about that, Daniel reminded me of a line that I used when I was with you all in Israel, that as we were thinking about this exhibit and retelling this story, and it became very clear to us that we think there's no better place in North America, in the United States, to tell the story of the founding of Israel than the Truman Library. And we've taken that very seriously. We have a Jewish community here in Kansas City that's been very generous, very supportive of this effort. And I think we are telling a very important, very clear-eyed, balanced history of this event and of Truman's role in it. But, when the fate of an entire people was at stake, Harry Truman recognized their plight, but he recognized more than that. He recognized them. These were people who had been through something that had, cataclysmic, catastrophic. I mean, there's no way to describe what World War II meant to the world and what those lessons meant to Harry Truman. So extending recognition, I think, was very important to Truman. It was a solution based not just simply on diplomacy or political expediency. It was something born of his own innate humanity. And as I mentioned to you a couple of years ago, 3 years ago it was, that we were together in Israel, the tables have now turned. And it is Harry Truman who needs to be recognized. recognized for all that he did and all that he brought to the highest office in the land, not just for the people of Israel or the Jewish people of America, but for the world. The lines on the map are literally different because this farmer from Missouri ascended to the highest office in the land. So I believe that we have come to that point where we have recognized Truman appropriately and properly and have brought his legacy into the 21st century for a 21st century audience. And I'm very eager to be able to welcome any and all of you to the exhibit virtually today. I hope in the coming months and years in person for some live tours and live events. I think you'll find there's nothing like this in the presidential library system. We've thought about every level of educational outreach opportunity, every learning style, every age group. And so with that, I think I want to invite you into the Truman Library for the next few minutes to enjoy a sneak peek for this group, a behind the scenes tour of what I think is one of the great installations dealing with presidential history to date.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum in Independence, Missouri. And look forward to being able to welcome you all here in person at some point. I'm Kurt Graham, the director here, and it's a great pleasure for me to be able to speak to an AJC audience. So behind me is the new entrance to the museum. It is a brand new facade that is on what used to be the back side of the museum. It is now the main entrance, has the presidential seal in it. And as you walk into this museum, I think one of the things you're going to notice is that there's first of all, there's a lot of construction in there, so it still looks like this is behind the scenes for sure. But there's something very elevating about this experience, about coming into this new entrance in this Grand View lobby, as we call it, in honor of Harry's Grand View farm. Welcome indoors. Here we are in what we call Grand View Hall, the new addition to the Truman Library. And this is a beautiful space. You can see it's also the staging for all the construction that's still going on. So it doesn't look as grand and elegant as it will. But it's a lovely space. When you walk in, there's a beautiful donor wall here on some granite. There'll be a statue of Harry Truman with a nice quote. Here it's a very popular photo opportunity. But what I love about what the designers did here is they've opened up a vista all the way into our courtyard. You can see the flag, which sadly is flying now at half staff. But Mr. and Mrs. Truman are buried in the courtyard. And so this nice line of sight gives you a sense of the gravesite and reminds people that that's there. It's a very, very important part of the visit. Some of the most solemn moments I've had here have been laying wreaths at Mr. Truman's gravesite with dignitaries and others, and hope that you all will get to see that when you're here. This is, we have a new museum store in this area, and there's a lovely sort of ticketing area as you come in, but this is also a place where we can have, when you all come out, we can have a nice big dinner here. We can do lots of things in this space. So this is the first thing that people see when they come in. It's a little cloudy today, but if it weren't, there's some beautiful windows overhead on the south side, and there's just a bunch of natural light that bathes in here and gives this a sense of elevation. And as I said, I think that this is finally an offering that is worthy of the 33rd president. So once you've entered the Grand Hall and you make a turn here after you get your ticket, you're going to enter the exhibit. And the exhibit begins in 1945, when Harry Truman reluctantly becomes vice president. And then suddenly, after just 82 days, Franklin Roosevelt dies. And it sets up this question, who is Harry Truman? The world really didn't know who he was. We think of Truman as we think of him today and all the great things that he accomplished. The reality is he was a farmer from Missouri who found his way to the Senate in kind of a weird way, frankly, and nobody really knew who he was. And so the question becomes, who is this guy, and can he, in their words, can he swing the job? Is he up to the task of leading the free world? And that allows us to jump back into Truman's early life and start to build the pieces of his character and his experience from a young boy forward that lead to his becoming the 33rd president of the United States. In this first gallery, we jump back to Truman's very early life, to his boyhood, and get a glimpse at who he was. One of the first things people will notice when they come in is Harry Truman's piano. He was very nearsighted and couldn't go out and play sports and run around with all the other boys. He wore glasses, and so he took piano lessons and became a concert pianist. He was a very accomplished musician. This talks about a lot of his early life, his early family. Roots are on this wall about where his family came from. Harry Truman descended from slave owners. So his background is very interesting in the sense that how did he become a champion of civil rights? The idea, as we'll see later in the exhibit, that in 1948 he recognized Israel and desegregated the armed forces, reached out to groups that had been oppressed. There's nothing in his background that would suggest that he would have a built-in empathy for people who had suffered. But he did. And it's really kind of amazing to see that develop out of these very early farming Missouri roots. We have a nice display here in the middle, too, that chronicles a major important part of his early life, and that was his courtship with the love of his life, Bess Wallace. And he wrote to her all through their early life, and even through their marriage. He wrote letters to her all the time. It's a lovely, beautiful exchange, and quite a love affair. Truman's early life, if you will, culminates in his early 30s when he makes the decision to join the war and go to World War I. He did not have to do that. He was too old to be drafted, but he said he wasn't about to be left out of one of the most important historical events in all of history. And so he finally got Bess to say yes to marrying him, but he postponed that marriage until he got back because he didn't want to leave her a widow or with someone to care for. And so he went to the war and served, and that's in the next gallery. So Truman's early life culminates in his decision to serve in World War I. And he did that, as I mentioned, in his early 30s. He was too old to be drafted. He did not need to go, but he made that decision to go. And he got promoted to captain, had a really great experience there in terms of learning that he could lead. It was through the experience in World War I that Truman came to understand that people followed him, that he had something about him. He was not a charismatic person in the traditional sense. He was not a great orator. He was not commanding in any particular way. But for some reason, something about his personality, the men respected him, and they followed him. And they followed him for the rest of his career. They were instrumental in helping him even in some of his later elections. He had a group of Irish Catholics from Kansas City who were very fond of drink, and he was a Southern Baptist with spectacles, and they took bets on how long he would last. They had a habit of going through captains, and he saw it through. There were 4 presidents who served in some aspect of World War I. Harry Truman is the only one who saw combat. And he came home convinced that he had some leadership skills, and he married his sweetheart Bess finally almost immediately upon his return from the war. And as you'll see in a moment, he went into business with his good friend Eddie Jacobson. Shortly after he returned from the war, Truman went into business with his good friend Eddie Jacobson. Now, Jacobson and Truman had met running a commissary on the base before they went over to France. So they had become good friends. They were essentially business partners then, and they were business partners again in a haberdashery down in Kansas City. Now, the 20s weren't a great economic time for these kinds of businesses, and they ended up losing out and going out of business. Truman did end up paying the debts on that business, by the way, but it was an important moment for him in that it was sort of an early venture. He had a new family, he was married and trying to provide, and this business was not going well. So about the time that this was all happening, Truman, his name was brought forward to the local political machine run by a guy named Tom Pendergast. Now, Truman had served in France with Tom's nephew. And so when they were looking for someone to be a judge, a county executive, basically a county commissioner, out in eastern Jackson County, which is where we are in Independence, nephew went to Tom Pendergast and said, there's this guy Truman, you ought to think about him. He's a good leader, and he knows what he's doing. And so Tom Pendergast is known for having run the Pendergast machine. Now, machine politics in these days, we often associate that with corruption. Today, we just call it party politics. It's basically an organization that was designed to promote certain candidates, and they often would go out and recruit people to run for office, and then call in all the chips that they had with their people to get the votes that were necessary. And so Harry Truman became part of this machine in the sense that he was chosen to be a judge in eastern Jackson County. But Truman turned his attention to paving roads in Jackson County. It's a very rural area. He wanted to help modernize it. He did a lot of good as a county commissioner, and he was troubled by the fact that he had to dispense patronage. He knew he had to do that, but he also never did anything corrupt in terms of, bribes or kickbacks or whatever. In fact, he got into a little bit of interesting trouble with the machine because he refused to give contracts to people who weren't the low bidders. And they finally realized that he wasn't going to break, that he wasn't going to do that kind of thing. So Truman maintained, I think, some really great integrity, despite the fact that when he finally gets to go to Washington, which was a surprise to Truman, he wanted to be governor of Missouri. That was his goal. But they overlooked him for governor, and he was very hurt by that. But a few years later, they tapped him on the shoulder, and in 1934, he ran for the U.S. Senate and went to Washington, where his fellow senators initially referred to him as the senator from Pendergast. So in 1934, Harry Truman went to the United States Senate, and he spent a decade there. And he absolutely loved the Senate. He won over his colleagues, as he did everywhere else that he ever went. And so he was reluctant to become vice president. As you know, Truman was only vice president for 82 days and only met with Franklin Roosevelt twice before the president died. So on April 12, 1945, Harry Truman is suddenly summoned to the White House, and he very famously said to Mrs. Roosevelt when she said, "Harry, the president is dead." And he said, "Ma'am, is there anything I can do for you?" She said, "The question is, Harry, is there anything we can do for you? For you're the one in trouble now." And I think Truman knew exactly how much trouble he was in. When you look at the look on his face and when you see moving images of this time, he and Bess both are like deer in the headlights. It's a very, very unsettling time for them. They're not only grieving the loss of Franklin Roosevelt, but they have to follow Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt in their respective roles. And it was a tall order. It was a lot to ask. But Truman, more than anybody else, experiences what we might call on-the-job training. We've all started big jobs before and wondered how we would do. Harry Truman, the first 4 months of his administration, one historian recently said, never has so much history been shoehorned into so little time. When Truman becomes president, he starts down a path toward ending the war. Harry Truman's first 4 months in office culminated with one of the biggest decisions for which he is associated, and that was the dropping of the atomic bombs in Japan. Harry Truman is the only man who knows what it's like to send over 100,000 people to their death at one time. And it was a very sobering, somber thing for him, but he knew he had to end the war. And we struggled as a museum to know how to deal with that issue. You can't skate around it, you can't ignore it, obviously, and yet you've got to be very sensitive to how to handle that. And so we came up with what I think is going to be a very compelling way of dealing with this. In this center case here, this cylinder, will be a safety plug that was in the bomb that went off over Nagasaki. It's about a 2-inch wooden piece that went inside the bomb, and in the course of dropping the bomb, the airman pulled the plug out, probably stuck it in his pocket, put the activation plug in, went through the protocols, released the bombs out the back of the plane. Now remember, they didn't know if the blast would be so significant that it would rattle the plane apart. They were in parachutes. They didn't know if they would live. So the last thing on his mind was this artifact, this piece of history that he had just retrieved and stuck in his pocket. But some years later, he called here and said, you know, I've got this thing. Would you all be interested in this? And it's like, oh my gosh, this is literally the trigger of the atomic age. You cannot get closer to the atomic era than this plug. It has the fingerprints of a U.S. airman on it. It is the trigger of the age. But juxtaposed with this, in the case behind, we have a little paper crane that was folded by Sadako Sasaki, who was a little girl 2 years old at the time of the bombings, and her brother Masahiro was 4. And Masahiro is a good friend of our honorary board chairman, Clifton Truman Daniel, who is the president's oldest grandson. And when I first got here about 5 years ago, Masahiro came and presented us with one of the last paper cranes that Sadako folded. And it has become, as you know, a symbol of peace around the world. And so here we have the trigger of the atomic age paired with the symbol of peace that grew out of this horrific event as a way of dealing with, you know, the reality and the hope and the peace that came with it. Sadako was told, or there was a Japanese tradition that said, if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, you'll have a wish granted. Now, one would assume that her wish was for life and health. And She was 12 years old when she died, 10 years after the blast. She died of radiation-induced leukemia. So she lived. She wasn't killed by the bombs immediately, but she did die from the effects of that. But if you think of her wish as being for peace and prosperity, I think we can say that perhaps those 1,000 paper cranes didn't go to waste. I think that with the Truman era, Churchill, others launched a period of peace and prosperity unlike any other in human history. So the real story for me about Harry Truman is not that he ended the war. This is just 4 months into his presidency. The real question is how he put the world back together. And that, to me, is the heart of Truman's legacy. And that happens in this next room with this fractured globe. One of the most difficult things that Truman faced was the world that had been literally torn apart by World War II. The single most cataclysmic event in the history of humanity. So many people dead, so much infrastructure destroyed, the way food is delivered, the way waste is taken away, the way power is and water and everything is taken to people is utterly destroyed in some countries. So rebuilding the world becomes priority number one. Also, he has all kinds of domestic challenges like rebuilding and retooling the economy, going from tanks and planes and guns to other kinds, to refrigerators and automobiles and the kinds of things that a domestic economy needs. So there are strikes, there are labor shortages, there are housing shortages. All of this hits Truman at the same time. So this globe plays all of the problems going on all over the world on the outside of it. And then Truman's response to those problems are what the perimeter of this room is all about. We have the Nuremberg trials. We have the Truman Doctrine. We have the Berlin Airlift. We have the Marshall Plan. We have ultimately the founding of NATO. All of these things that Truman did to respond to a world in crisis and put the world back together. And it's because of this, what he did, that people look at him as having accomplished so much in terms of peace and prosperity for the world. This was an unparalleled time, unprecedented by any standard of any time in human history. And Harry Truman is the man with his hands on the reins to help piece this world back together. So now we're in the room that is dedicated to the recognition of the State of Israel, which, as you all know, was one of Truman's very big, very important decisions. And this room is wonderful. Both it's larger than a lot of the other galleries, and it just worked out that way because it's about the midway point through the exhibit. So we put in a kind of a nice, larger seating area here, partly because we have a wonderful show that is narrated by Judy Woodruff, a film that tells the story of the founding of Israel and Truman's role in that. But also because we need a place to be able to corral a bunch of third graders and sit them down and give them some instructions for a scavenger hunt or something like that within the galleries. So this is kind of a resting place, if you will, kind of a midway point where people can sit down, enjoy the film. But then this room also has traditional artifacts on display and also the story through panels and things around the side. So I think the story of Israel is really well covered here. One of the impetuses behind our doing this major renovation was there were several aspects of Truman's legacy that were maybe mentioned before, but not in any great depth. And so with that, things like the recognition of Israel, his civil rights legacy, his World War I service, and certainly the Korean War, those were all kind of underrepresented. And now I think we've remedied that with this multi-million-dollar makeover that really gives the depth and the texture to Truman's experience. And I want to just draw your attention to this case. This is a very traditional museum-type display, but it has some very important artifacts in it, including a very special Torah and menorah that were gifts to Truman from Chaim Weizmann and Ben Gurion, respectively. He knew these leaders. I mean, they were friends of his. I wanted to just take a second and tell you about this Torah. This is maybe one of my favorite artifacts in the museum for the simple reason that there's a very personal story connected to it. When Weizmann was coming to America to go to the White House to meet the president shortly after the recognition, he desperately needed a gift to take to the president. And so he called a rabbi in New York named Louis Finkelstein. And he was the head of the seminary there. And he had a collection, had a museum that he ran as part of the theological seminary there. And he said, "Can you give me something?" Wiseman's people said, "Can you give us something to give to the president?" And he said, "Well, I can't just take something out of the collection. I mean, it's not mine. I can't just do that. That wouldn't be ethical." He said, "But I do have a Sefer Torah that was commissioned and done for my son's bar mitzvah." This boy was about 20 by that time, but when he was 13, he had been made a gift of this Torah. But it's so valuable, you don't just leave that on the coffee table. I mean, it was in the vaults where it would eventually be displayed. So he owned this, and he figured he could part with this. And so I've met the rabbi. He became a rabbi himself, this young boy. His name is Ezra Finkelstein. He was 13 years old when he got this Torah, and about 20 when it was gifted by his father to Chaim Weizmann and then to the president. And what's really remarkable about that is I asked Ezra, "When did you find out that your father was going to give your Torah to President Truman?" And he said, "When I saw the picture on the front page of the New York Times with my Torah, I knew that." And he said, "I took it as a compliment that my father knew I would be okay with that." But, I was able to go to Philadelphia to the National Museum of American Jewish History last year, just before COVID. And we loaned this Torah to the museum to display there for about 6 months. And as we took it there, at the beginning of that loan, it was the 80th anniversary celebration of Rabbi Finkelstein's bar mitzvah. He's 93 years old, sharp as a tack, lives in New York City, and just became the dearest friend over this experience. We were there, and we were able to unveil the Torah in his presence for the first time in more than 80 years, and he choked up. I mean, he teared up to be reunited with this artifact. And the story goes that some of the Jewish leaders from New York thought this would be such a nice artifact, since it had been in Truman's possession, to display at one of the many Jewish museums or at the seminary or somewhere. And they said, "Well, Mr. President, don't you think it would be wonderful if we had this to display for our people to see?" And Truman snapped back, "Don't you think it would be wonderful to have this in my library, so people who come to see my story will have this to enjoy?" In other words, Truman wasn't about to budge. He wasn't about to give the Torah back, and he loved having this. He valued these gifts. And as I said earlier on when we were in the room about his youth, Truman is such an unlikely champion of civil rights. This gallery and the adjoining gallery that talks about his incredible civil rights legacy, the first president to address the NAACP, the first president to coin and use the term civil rights. He had a sense of an oppressed people needing a champion. And for whatever reason, Harry Truman, through some moral center of his own, moved forward to become that champion. And, as much as he did for people, it's really amazing to me on the subject, now shifting a little bit about civil rights, on the subject of civil rights, later in his life, they were doing an oral history interview with him, and he started reflecting on the status of African Americans in our country. And he said, it wasn't until I went to the war that I realized how badly people were being treated. And of course, he came from a slave-holding family. He grew up in Missouri. He said, I just assumed that's the way things were. He said, I tried as president to do as much as I could to help improve their plight. But sometimes when I think back on these things, I wish I had done more. And I think that is just the most telling quote of almost anything that he ever said, because as much as he did, he still recognized that there was work to do. And as we see in this room, there's still work to do in the Middle East. There's still work to do domestically when it comes to race relations in our own country. And would that we had a Harry Truman to lead us through that work. This museum attempts to encapsulate whatever it was about him that made that kind of thinking possible. And it's, I think, a real tribute to him. He would have been uncomfortable with this much focus on him, but it's important, I think, for us that we recognize that there was a time when such leadership existed. And it wasn't liberal or conservative or Republican or Democrat. It was just American leadership that was on display both within our country and around the world. And to that, I think we owe Truman a great debt, and I hope that you and he will be proud of this offering.
Finally, election day arrives, and the polls are even the weather seems to be against President Truman as he goes to vote in independent Missouri.
You know, the interesting thing to know about the election of 1948, it's one of the great electoral moments in our national history, but it happens on the heels of the recognition of Israel and the desegregation of the armed forces and the federal workforce. Truman recognizes Israel in May, desegregates the government and the armed forces in July, and then has to run for election in the fall. Now, there are people who will say at the time and since that, well, Truman was pandering for Jewish votes and for African American votes. I always like to remind people this is 1948 and that this was not exactly the heyday of equality in American society, that Truman alienated a lot more people than he drew to him with both of these decisions. And particularly, the racial question divided his own party. And Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats, what we call the racist wing of the Democratic Party in the South, split from Truman and really strongly jeopardized his ability to win that election. We have here a little train exhibit, the back of a train. As you know, he crisscrossed the country a couple of different times over just a matter of weeks, over a couple of month period. And people stopped taking polls. They just figured, poor Harry, he's done for. And he comes back and he wins this. He predicted what the Electoral College would do, and he didn't miss it by very far. He knew what it would be. And it's just one of those great moments where he saw something that nobody else saw. And as far as the risks that he took, another insight into his character. Somebody told him that it was going to be a difficult road making some of these decisions. And he said, I would rather be right than be president. And it's hard for us to imagine someone today feeling that strongly about those kinds of things. But again, I've often said that Harry Truman not only made what he thought were the right decisions, but he did so for the right reasons. If it cost him politically, he made a lot of decisions that could have cost him politically. And I'm certainly not suggesting he got everything right all the time. But I think when it came to the big moments, the big decisions that have really set up and handed off the world that you and I have inherited, I think that Harry Truman was on the right side of history and on the right side of decency. And I think that's why we remember him as we do today. So once Truman wins re-election, or wins election in his own right, this is the first time that he actually stood for election by himself in 1948. So he was no longer the sidekick that happened to be there when the president died. He was actually the president that the people wanted, and he can now pursue his own agenda. And so he introduces the fair deal. What's interesting about the fair deal is you look at all of these things, farm aid, civil rights, taxes, national health insurance, affordable housing, labor, Social Security, antitrust laws. Think about today the big tech companies that are always, education. It's amazing to think about how little has changed since Truman was president. And when you judge this by how much he was able to get passed as far as legislation, you might say this was a little bit of a failure. This really wasn't a very great program. But when you look at all that has happened subsequently, and I'll give you one quick example. Lyndon Johnson, on Christmas Day 1968, called Harry and Bess Truman at home. Johnson was just about to leave office. And he called them to wish them a Merry Christmas, and he was talking to Bess Truman, and he said, Bess, my staff gave me a plaque of all the major accomplishments, legislative accomplishments of my administration. He said, I was looking at that the other night, and I went down through it, and I recognized that about half of those things started with Harry. And he so gave Truman credit. I mean, you have to look at Truman proposed national health insurance. Well, he didn't get it, but Lyndon Johnson came here to this library and in our auditorium on that stage, signed the Medicare-Medicaid Act in 1965, and gave the first and second Medicare cards to Harry and Bess. Card number 1 and card number 2. And so, and you carry that forward to health care. I mean, all of these things come forward, and they can all trace back to ideas and things that Truman put forward. So you would think after he wins election, he's got his own legislative agenda coming forward. Things seem to be on the up and up, and you would think that everything would be. But we run into a problem in the second term that is going to be difficult for Truman for the rest of his time in office. Everything was going great for Truman after the election of 1948, but he soon ran into another kind of problem. One of the issues, this is a little bit before McCarthy gets on the scene, but there's an issue about loyalty in the government. Do we have communist people in the State Department, that kind of thing? So Truman has to come up with these loyalty oaths to try and ferret out communists and others who are maybe going to be spies or work against the purposes of the United States. So what we've done here that's very interesting is we put together this loyalty oath test. It's a game where 6 people sit around this table, and the way it worked in those days is if you were suspected of being disloyal to the country or a spy or something, you would be brought before a board of your peers, and they would ask you questions designed to ferret out whether you were a threat or not. And we have not made these questions up. All the questions that you see in this game come from actual questionnaires at the time. And these questions are things like, how do you feel about interracial marriage? How do you feel about homosexuality? Do you know any homosexuals? What church do you go to and how often? These are the kinds of questions that were designed to determine whether someone was a good, loyal citizen or not. Now, we recognize those questions as being not only offensive, but would be illegal today. But nevertheless, in the late 1940s and early 50s, that's where Americans were in terms of trying to ferret out who was to be trusted and who was not to be trusted. Now, Truman would have gotten through that, and everything would have been fine, but for a phone call he received in 1950 when he's home here at Independence. An advisor was on the other end of the phone when he picked it up, and he said, Mr. Truman, Mr. President, I have some very serious news. North Korea has invaded South Korea. And from that point on, Truman's presidency would be changed. He had a major series of decisions and very serious events to face that really prevented him from realizing a lot of the dreams that he had, I think, for his second term. So when Truman ended his presidency in 1953, when Dwight Eisenhower is elected president, Truman did not run again, so he served all but 82 days of 2 full terms, so he figured he'd had his fair share. He returned here to Independence and did what no president had ever done. In his post-presidency, he built this library. And this was the first purpose-built post-presidency. It was the focus of his post-presidential life. And he had an office here. He came here for many, many years, up until his death in 1972. This library was dedicated in 1957. Took about 4 years to build the original structure here. And after it was built, Truman commissioned local artist, very famous Midwestern painter Thomas Hart Benton, to do this mural that really encapsulated in Truman's mind the importance of Independence, Missouri, his hometown. Truman could have built this library anywhere. He had offers for property in other places, but he wanted to come back to Independence. And so he came here, built this library, and wanted to acknowledge and honor the fact that Independence was the jumping off point for westward migration. So that's what you see in this mural. You know, this isn't a mural about Harry Truman. It's not about the White House. It's not about politics. It's about westward expansion, which Truman was very proud of. Now, this mural is dated both in terms of its approach, its context, but also the style. But it is a very iconic style, and it's a piece that people remember. Anybody who's ever been here will remember this. It's stunning, the colors, the size. It's really a very beautiful piece. And Truman told Benton, paint democracy. That was the only charge that he gave him. And so now this would not be our definition of democracy today, but it's interesting that from that era, about 1960 that this was put in, this is what they would have been focused on. Now, it's interesting to note also that we have commissioned a statue of Harry Truman to go into the rotunda at the Capitol. As you know, every state has two statues in the U.S. Capitol. And believe it or not, Missouri does not have Harry Truman in the Capitol. There is a senator from the 19th century, a forebearer of Thomas Hart Benton, also named Thomas Hart Benton, whose statue is coming out of the Capitol in order to make room for Harry Truman's statue to go back in. So there's kind of a poetry here, the way that all kind of runs together. Behind me, you'll see an open door. That is to the replica Oval Office that we have here. It's still being renovated, being put back together. But when you come here on your visit, we we hope that you'll enjoy seeing a replica Oval Office where Harry Truman made so many of these important decisions. Truman is known as a man who made so many important decisions, and I think when he gets back here to independence, he can finally kind of relax and reflect on what it is that he has done. And I would challenge anyone to come up with an 8-year period that saw as many monumental decisions as those that Harry Truman faced. He was someone who not only made a lot of decisions, but more importantly, he was decisive. And I think that that's what separates him from a lot of other leaders at the time. We're going to head out and just go to the Legacy Gallery here and look at a couple of last things on the way as we wind up the tour. So as we conclude the overview of Truman's life and his legacy and his presidency, we end with a gallery here that we call the Legacy Gallery. And it's very interesting to me that unlike any other president, Truman is beloved on both sides of the aisle. I mean, one of the things I say to people often is the greatest thing about being in the Truman business is you really can't offend anybody. People on the far right, people on the far left, people in the middle, they all go back and look to Harry Truman as a model of good decision making, a model of good behavior, and a model of how to lead. And so I have yet to meet anyone who is critical of, not maybe critical of an individual decision, but in terms of the overall legacy, the way Truman conducted himself in public life, the way he returned to his hometown. He said he never forgot who he was or where he came from or where he was going back to. And he came here without any fortune. He left office with no more money than he went into office. He raised enough money to do this library. You know, we wish he'd had the zeal that modern presidents have now when they leave office and raised, several $100 million for us to have it in endowment. He didn't do that because he just needed what he needed to build the building, and that was that. But he didn't have Secret Service protection at first. He did not have a staff. He did not have a pension. All of that stuff came later. And a lot of it happened, the Secret Service and whatnot happened after the Kennedy assassination at Johnson's insistence that he wanted Harry and Bess protected. They didn't necessarily want that for themselves, but they acquiesced to Johnson's insistence. So it's amazing, I think, to think of a legacy. I don't think you could find another single figure, maybe Abraham Lincoln, maybe Washington, to whom so many American leaders would look to as a touchstone. Certainly no one in the modern era, I think, comes close to what Truman was. Both, the man, the myth, the legend. I mean, everything about him fits what people aspire to, or at least claim to aspire to today. Let's get one final thought from Walter Cronkite just around the corner here. As we conclude the museum tour here, and as visitors are on their way out of the museum, you see over my shoulder the inner courtyard where we started, where Harry and Bess Truman are buried. You see the flag out there. Today it's at half staff, but there's an eternal flame here just behind me that goes all the time. But on the way out here, there's a very interesting little video piece that we won't be able to show you right now, but it's the 1972 internment coverage from CBS News of Harry Truman's funeral and burial. And Walter Cronkite was narrating that coverage, and it was very telling toward the end of that. He said that Truman was someone who was unlike anybody who had ever held the office before. And he said he was just in such an interesting transitional time. And he said because he was a man uniquely of his time, we will never see his like again. And in this sense, I think Cronkite is right. I think we will never see a non-college educated president again. We will never see anybody just kind of from the bootstraps, from the countryside, come up and be a farmer, a failed businessman, and go off to war and come back and find themselves in politics and somehow work their way up to the presidency. That's just not how the recruitment and the running for that office works anymore. But I do hope that in this sense that Cronkite was wrong. I do hope that we will find in all of our parties and among all of our people who had the kind of moral core, the kind of certainty that Harry Truman had about doing the right thing at the right time and for the right reasons. I do hope that we will find people of that sound judgment and that ability to make decisions in the public good, to not so much pursue his own interests, but to pursue the interests of the Commonwealth, of the common good. And in that sense, I think Harry Truman is a president who represents in the 20th century what the founders always had in mind. When you go back to the Revolution and the early founding, you read about what they had in mind for public service. I think they envisioned Harry Truman. I think that he is the man that they would most point to in our century, in our time, to be able to say, this is what we meant when we said a disinterested public servant who could put the good of the whole ahead of his own self-interest.
Kurt, thank you so much. That was truly spectacular. And I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that we can't wait to visit Independence, Missouri, to visit you and to see what looks to be a truly remarkable museum. So thank you for giving us that insight and a sneak peek before it officially opens to the public.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time.
I know we have very limited time left, but we did receive a question from Julia Steinman, who's a high school student in New Jersey, that I wanted to ask you in closing. What are some of the lessons, she asked, what are some of the lessons that President Truman's legacies might teach us about future leaders, might teach future leaders about the U.S.-Israel relationship specifically?
Well, I think, again, I go back to Harry Truman as a decision maker, and I go back to Harry Truman as a man of decency. I think he had the ability to recognize the truth, to recognize situations in real time. And I think that what allowed him to do that was the ability to suspend how a particular decision might help or hurt him in that moment. And I'm not saying that Harry Truman wasn't a politician and that he didn't think about those things. That would be naive and silly to suggest that he wasn't aware of how the public might react to something. And I'm sure he thought about those things. And I'm sure there was some calculation at times in what he did. But when it came to making big decisions, he was able to do that. And I think, to answer your question directly is to this young lady to say that you and your generation have an opportunity to hold people accountable, to make moral decision-making something that is rewarded instead of something that is punished. I think that we sometimes wait for a Harry Truman to come along as if a single person can kind of fix everything for us. The reality is, I think it's Harry Truman. The lesson to me is we need to become more like Harry Truman ourselves. Not that any of us are going to run for office or become president, but we need to put ourselves in a position where our moral judgment, our decision-making prowess, and our ability to do the right thing at the right time is ever present. And when that happens, then we will hold our leaders accountable and bring forth better people.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.